Either we conclude sadly that our hope of understanding the world passed away along with the celestial spheres and the four elements. Perhaps revelation is a loaded term for this situation. Let's think about that. Let's think about that. Let's think about that. Let's think about that.
All right, we're back for another edition of Let's Think About That. I got Ben, my brother, back on again, and he has a question that's been burning a hole in his brain for quite a while, it sounds like, and it is on the nature of education, and that coincides nicely with some of my own recent interests, especially with a few thinkers I've encountered who are trying to define terms like wisdom and what exactly that means. And it certainly seems that education and knowledge and discernment all are parts of what might constitute wisdom, and yet none of them seems to be the whole thing. And there is an extremely wide variety of opinions on precisely what education is and what it ought to be. And we decided that we would try to hash some of that out today. Look at a few different ways that education has been used, the term, and what might be the proper way to view it in regards to the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of meaning, which are both terms that are difficult to define, but have the quality that you tend to know it when you see it, at least I feel like, or when you experience wisdom, when you experience meaning, you recognize it when it's there, even if you can't always trace out the path that helped you arrive to it. So, Ben, I'll turn the floor over to you. What's on your mind on this?
Well, I want to know, I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but I want to know what education is and what it's supposed to be, because historically speaking, the idea of education, regardless of how restricted it was and who was allowed to be educated and so on, for most of at least Western civilized history, education was viewed as the privileged path to genuine freedom. We also, I mean, obviously, the West has a long tradition of devotion to political freedom, but I think that there's a longer and an older tradition of viewing freedom as essentially something which is acquired not just through study, but study, thinking, writing, expressing your thoughts in conversation, and I want to know, because obviously those are symptoms, you might say, of education. But what is education? What is it? If we could give it a definition, and how does it relate to what we would call the meaningful life? To ask a nice simple question, because I think that from Plato onward, there's been a sense that how you understand. Let me put it this way: if education is, I think everyone agrees that education is meant to achieve something or produce something in the to make a student a certain way, regardless of what you actually assume the end result is. And if I think that what you wind up seeing is that from Plato onward, he says the way you conceive of the end, the way you conceive of what constitutes an educated person is obviously going to condition how you understand the process of educating that person. So if the meaningful life is what we want, then how can we arm someone, so to speak, to live the meaningful life? I think that's the question that's kind of been bothering me, is what is, well, I guess it's two questions and they're interrelated. What is education, and how is education related to meaning? And I think actually, taking a cue from Plato, it might be more helpful to start off asking, and I guess only provisionally answering, the question, what is a meaningful life, in order to really get a sense of what education is and how it should go about doing whatever it's meant to do. Is education more like learning what to think or learning how to think? What to read or how to read, metaphorically. Hopefully, we all know how to read at the point we're undertaking serious education.
Mm-hmm. Although even something as basic as literacy can't be overlooked as a component of education, simply because it grants your mind the fluency to process ideas that enables insight.
Yeah.
So even something as basic as that is part of it. But yeah, continue.
I think I've stated those are the two questions. What is education? How does it relate to the meaningful life? And I actually think we should start off with the second question. And I think because you were the one who really drew my attention to the specific phrase, the crisis of meaning, which you can find addressed in people like Jordan Peterson, or from what I understand, what you've mentioned, Ken Wilber. I think in his own way, the late Sir Roger Scruton was addressing many similar concerns. But I think you were the one who really kind of unified those various strands of thought under the general heading of the crisis of meaning. So if our goal is to figure out what constitutes a meaningful life, I would want to kind of toss that to you. What do you think constitutes meaning? Just toss you a nice softball here.
Right, yeah, nice easy one to start with. I mean, I don't have a precise definition of it, but I think there's several qualities that point to it. And actually, this is a great example to start with. I actually just finished reading a book called Reality is Broken, and it was written by a video game designer, who she decided to look at the qualities of what makes a great video game and even what makes an addictive video game. The word addictive has a negative connotation, and there certainly is such a thing as video game addiction. But she pointed out that the reason that people become so addicted to video games and spend so much time playing them is that they have been carefully crafted to meet the meaning needs of the human person and the human mind in an artificial way that, because of its artificiality, works so perfectly that it makes reality, whatever the real world is, pale in comparison to the point where there is what people are referring to as a virtual exodus occurring, where vast percentages of society are spending more of their waking hours in some sort of virtual world than they are in the real world. To the point where you have extreme video gaming where people are playing, 50 to 80 hours a week of whatever game, but typically these kind of massively multiplayer games like World of Warcraft, which she pointed out is an awful lot of work. It is an extremely task-oriented game. And it's baffling to an outside observer why somebody would go to work all day, assuming they have a job and haven't completely left the world, why you would go to work all day and come home and continue to work more in a virtual world. Like, it seems that you would want to watch TV or relax and do something passive. But she notes that, people don't opt for that when they have video games. And through an extensive examination, she comes up with a few different qualities that seem to be intrinsic ingredients of the meaningful life that video games supply in spades. And one of them is a clear normative structure. You know what you have to do to get better and to level up, and there's very clear instant feedback on that. There's a life bar, there's points, there's a checklist of items that you have to complete on your quest. That's a World of Warcraft feature. So you get feedback and you know exactly what you have to do to level up. There is a very clear set of rules that govern the world that everybody is abiding by, and they're widely known and available to be understood, and there's no question. So it's clear what the boundaries of the world are, and it's clear who's good, who's evil, and what the mission is. And there's also in most games, there's also an overarching narrative to the entire structure. So you know where you fit in the story. So a game like Halo has a very clear black and white structure. There's an alien race that is threatening to destroy the human race, and you have been recruited to be part of the intergalactic army to defeat these aliens and defend the human race. And that is the story, and you know what you have to do, you know how the things you have to achieve in order to become better, and you understand what the rules are, and they're very clear. And she said those kind of conditions tend to foster also a sense of awe, particularly in an extremely intricate and detailed game like Halo, where the amount of engineering and artistic work that goes into creating the universe is awe-inspiring in itself, simply just the vast scale of the game. And it also encourages tremendous amounts of teamwork because everybody wants to feel like they are part of this great thing that is beyond them. So she has an interesting chapter on the quest for 10 billion kills, where worldwide Halo players recruited new players into the fold and took it upon themselves to train bad players to become better and to lift everyone up to become an effective soldier in the game in order to reach the milestone of 10 billion kills, which is an insane number of kills in this game. And to an outside observer, it seems absolutely absurd because in reality that has accomplished nothing. But they've still attained that feeling of awe, of being part of something great, of being part of a story and knowing exactly what they have to do to be an effective part of that. And so I would say that a meaningful existence would be the type of existence that is like that, except in the real world. You understand kind of what the story is, what you have to do to get better, and you have opportunities to contribute to something that is beyond yourself, and yet still that you are still able to feel like an individual and feel like your individual contributions do matter, even though the overall goal transcends who you are. And she doesn't mention it in the book, but the context that I heard about the book was discussing how the loss of traditional religion, especially in the West over the last couple hundred years, has played a large role in the meaning crisis because there's been a void created, a vacuum created by the absence of religion, which used to supply most of those needs that the video game world is filling. A story, a normative order, and a role for you to play in something that's greater than yourself, in addition to feelings of awe, community, etc. So that is, I think, kind of the overall sense of what I have as a meaningful life is one that has those kind of characteristics. And that seems to arise from some kind of interaction between the individual and the world. It's not something where it's like pure existentialism, where meaning is entirely something that you impose on a world that has none in itself, nor is it the type of feeling that you get purely from the world already has a meaning and you just are looking at it and seeing it. It's something that kind of arises between the two of them. So that's a lot, but that is kind of, I think, a good ballpark to look in for what a meaningful life is. And education, insofar as it helps one to achieve those goals and see the world in those ways, that would, to me, seem to be the way that education serves the meaningful life.
Okay.
So I will turn that back over to you after that lengthy spiel.
So it sounds like if I jotted some stuff down while you were talking. Just to restate, an experience of normativity, clear values, and the sense of having one's place in a narrative. Those seem to be the three, and the key thing being that these are not things that you produce. These are things that you participate in something which is, from the standpoint of at least the gamer, something which he has the experience of discovering for himself. It's there, but he has to go through the experience of discovering it. And it's one of the reasons that games like No Man's Sky, in theory, what's so cool about that game, or the game Morrowind back in the day.
Yeah.
Part of the reason it was so fun to play the games, I actually had more fun exploring the world than ever doing any of the quests, I will admit. But part of what's fun about it is the experience of discovering a world. I mean, there's a similar sort of thing, I think, just to kind of add to what you've been saying and to kind of take it. It's not just the realm of video games, but I don't know if you remember watching the documentary Darkhan.
No, I never saw that, but that seemed to be very influential for a few members of the family.
Where it's about LARPers, live action role players,
right? Yeah,
and kind of interviewing them, and they give many of the same reasons. They give explicitly many of the similar reasons to what was the lady's name, by the way, who wrote the book? that you're talking about?
I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Okay,
I'll tag it into Creditor, though, because it's a good book.
Because it seems like what she's intuiting, many of these people say explicitly that there's what they love about LARPing is they're first of all, they're with people. Like that's a key thing. It's a communal experience, and it's also, there's a sense of, I have a quest, I'm on a mission to stop the bad guy, and the mission begins somewhere, has a middle, has an end. I think a similar reason that people are super enthusiastic, say, about endless fantasy novels, there's something similar. Getting lost in a world in which those very same things are evident. So it seems like normativity, values, and narrative that's a good way of looking at meaning. I guess what I find interesting then is, and this I think pertains to very practically the question of education. Why? Because the title of the book, right, is Reality is Broken. And she's saying that for some reason, people are undertaking a virtual exodus and finding meaning in what's ultimately artificial, presumably because they can no longer find it in what's real.
Yeah.
Why do you think? Because I have my own ideas about, and there are a lot of. It's not just like one. Oh, it's this or it's that. It's a whole network of interrelated circumstances and ideas. But why do you think people have lost? People feel that normativity, values, and a sense of narrative are so inaccessible in the real world that they need to kind of turn to these alternative realities in order to find that. Because I think this pertains especially to the question of, because presumably we spend lots of money on education in America, higher education especially, but also high school education. So it's not as though it's not as though there's no education and that's why people are finding it hard to access. In many ways, there's kind of a glut of education, and yet people are finding less and less solace in reality. So why do you think that? That seems kind of like an interesting paradox, if education is related to the meaningful life the way I think it is.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, the author's name is Jane McGonigal, for anyone who's interested. It's a really good book. It's worth checking out. Why do I think that is the case? As I mentioned, I think, this isn't my original observation, but I agree with it, that I think the loss of belief in traditional religions, especially Christianity in the West, but I think all of the traditional monotheisms have suffered substantially, at least in the sense that people really believe them to actually be what is happening. There may be a lot of people who agree that Jesus or Muhammad was a great teacher and that there's a lot to it, or even the substantial success of a figure like Jordan Peterson in just resurrecting the power of the stories of Scripture looked at as myth, which has actually been tremendously successful, interestingly enough. So there's something that could be said there. I also think that the diminishment of ideals has also played a great role in the crisis, because ideals, I think, are often looked at, really anything that's considered to be transcendent is looked at with suspicion. I think because of the tendency of the Western world, kind of post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution, to sink into utopian ideologies of various forms, which ended up in utter disaster and bloodshed and starvation for millions of people.
Idealism does violence to the real, is what you're saying, effectively.
Yeah, that it's dangerous, that people start to see ideals as being dangerous delusions that draw people into totalizing schemes that end up being extremely destructive, and that everybody's gotten a bit gun shy as far as tolerating ideals in our society. And generally, I had this experience when I was in junior high, going to a prep school in St. Louis, where any kind of references I would make to overarching virtues like honesty or loyalty, or simply just being a good person, however loosely defined, some kind of transcendent ideal that you were trying to conform yourself to in some way, would typically be shot down and ridiculed and derided immediately, even by kids my own age who were in 8th grade, which means that was being absorbed from adult generations. And I think a lot of that seeped into the culture as a somewhat understandable reaction to the excesses of idealism in the 1800s and early 1900s. So I think both of those have left a vacuum, and that seems to leave the alternative of basically just being a scientific materialist and essentially denying that reality has any meaning, and yet still needing to just kind of come up with something that works for yourself. Because, I mean, even people who are scientific materialists like Richard Dawkins still use the language of values. They talk about awe and beauty of science and just the value of discovery for its own sake, and they use language of higher and lower thinking. So they still have a hierarchy of values of some kind, even though, like, if everything's meaningless, like, that's just something arbitrary. And I think that the other alternative that you see is, like, people join some sort of fundamentalist sect like ISIS or an extreme Bible thumper Protestant type of group that essentially just ignores that whole problem and just holds steadfast to, frankly, irrational beliefs and a sort of ancient, I don't know about ancient, but a pre-rational version of religion that
tribalism.
A religious tribalism that is equally harmful. So I think all of those things have kind of created the conditions where people are hungry for those experiences of normativity and a narrative, etc. But there's not really a communal way or a tradition that they can plug into in order to receive it. And I think that the entrepreneurs of capitalism, once computer technology attained a certain level of competence as far as recreating virtual worlds, seized on that and found a market for it. And in the book, McGonigal even references how a game as simple as Pong replicates a lot of those feelings, especially the state of like flow. You see the score, you know how you're getting better, you know exactly what you have to do, and you can also kind of drop the running commentary in your head about what is happening and simply do it. Flow is another thing that comes up a lot in the book. So all of those things, I think the absence of ideals and religion, or at least the opportunity for more balanced, integrated religion as opposed to fundamentalism, I think all those things create a vacuum.
That's interesting. I mean, I agree with all those things, but I also think that, and it's kind of funny because I'm a pretty strong believer, but I have a resistance to the idea that somehow it's solely the loss of religion being what is it? Charles Taylor has a phrase that I think this is key, but I don't think it's the only factor. The idea of belief in God as an option, one existential option among several. Whereas he said, that seems to be, to him, what distinguishes a secular age versus previous ages in which that was not something that, even if you had atheists here and there, it was not something that was viewed as, it was not something you just go, I decided to be an atheist. I've decided, I don't think it makes sense to believe, and so I don't believe in God. So that was not, even though that you occasionally had it happen, it was usually among people who were, frankly, more educated. But it was not the kind of posture you're going to have just readily available as an alternative way to live. So I think it's important to recognize the influence that the great world religions have had, and sort of the decline of religion as a respectable and acceptable way of life for a rational person. I think has done a great deal of damage to the meaningful life. But I also think too that the sense of, I think this, maybe I'm addressing a different phase of history, but I think there's also the severing of finding norms and values grounded in nature. I think the idea, because I mean, for the classical world, I mean, the Stoics sort of summing up, and in some ways kind of distilling and maybe even somewhat changing the wisdom of the ancient Greek philosophers and the Romans. Their idea was, the Roman Stoics, the whole goal was follow nature. Nature can be trusted. Nature provides you with norms accessible to reason. Nature is saturated with a sense of value, and following reason, following nature, that's good. Nature itself is its own. Basically, it's a self-evident value lies in following nature, and the good man is the man who does what nature tells him, and the bad man is the one who acts contrary to nature. And I think that that's distilling what I think was probably a very strong, if unconscious, assumption across the pre-Christian, I guess I get the pre-axial age, as to use the current term for it, in which you look at myths, for instance, and all the gods in, like, say, Homer or in the Aeneid, the gods, they're capricious and they're crazy, but they themselves are bound by certain values, even though they're strong and they can kind of resist them. But if you really read the Aeneid, or if you read especially Homer, I think with an open mind, you see that Homer, I think, very, very astutely observes that even the gods are bound by norms and values which are written into the fabric of reality itself. There's a really moving scene in the Iliad, I think, when Zeus earlier in the book earlier in the whole work has decreed that, okay, we're going to give Achilles honor because he's been deprived in some way of his just due. But in the course of Zeus fulfilling that plan, he promised to do it for Achilles, but in the course of that, it becomes clear that one of his many mortal children that he has had with mortal women is going to have to die in order for that to happen. And rather than being a pure embodiment of the plan, Zeus weeps tears of blood, Homer says, at the fact that he has to lose his beloved mortal son. But even though he doesn't stop it, so even Zeus recognizes, no, I've made a promise. Justice is something that needs to be abided by, and I can't break that. And he does elsewhere. He's capricious, but I think there's that sense which is kind of intuitive in many of the great poets, but which I think you see translated into people like Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics, where there's a sense that nature will disclose, if you consult the observable world, you consult the cosmos, you will find revealed there norms, however hard they are to find or however indistinct they are at first. And that also kind of ties into a confidence in the power of reason to do this, but they believe that norms and values can actually be, the right norms and values by which we're going to live and live well are actually accessible through looking at nature and through the work of reason, kind of engaging with nature. And I think that in the early ages of Christian Europe, I think that philosophy and Christianity really actually did wind up with a very close relationship, to the point where much later the loss of Christianity, I think, ipso facto meant the loss of the that initial conviction and the power of reason to arrive at knowledge from nature. Even though you can say, well, what about the Enlightenment and rationalism? But I think that if you look closely, there is a very, very different conception of nature in the Enlightenment thinkers than there is in the pre-Christian philosophers of Greece and Rome. And I think that's another factor in there, because it isn't simply the sense that the loss of a religious, because I think it's too easy to kind of suspect the sort of the Feuerbach idea that that's just because people were being deluded by religion, and that having lost religion, they've realized the real state in which they find themselves is in an incomprehensible universe with lots of people around and lots of weapons to do damage to people, and people have been basically existentially neurotic ever since. I think that if you remember that prior to Christianity, prior to any of the great monotheistic religions, there did exist, and however, not everyone was a philosopher, but the philosophers and the myth makers had a close relationship, I think. A tense relationship, but a close one, and they shared, I think, a common assumption about trusting nature and trusting reason to understand nature. So I think having also lost that, because I don't think, we could talk about that, but I don't think nowadays that there's a massive confidence in turning to nature to reveal norms. I suppose you might see it in something like, in the Enlightenment era, someone like Rousseau, perhaps, and nowadays maybe in the environmental movement, where people say, look, nature does it better. Man, as he exists now, is more of a plague on nature, and if we would just live naturally, live organically, we'd be better off. So it's completely gone, but I don't think it's accorded mainstream respect, and I don't think it has. I don't think that goes along with the concomitant confidence in the power of reason to understand nature. I think that pairing of confidence in nature and confidence in reason, I think, was distinctive of the ancient world, and I think is also a major loss, which has done a great deal of damage. That was itself a spiel.
But do you think? I mean, do you think that? Are you referring to nature in terms of just like the biological world, or?
I guess I'm thinking of it in like capital N nature, in the sense of like the world in which we find ourselves. Mountains, trees, animals, are ourselves as animals.
The way things move apart from human manipulation.
Yeah,
maybe?
I think that's how it would be.
The way things.
How it would be understood.
Okay. I mean, I think there's a lot there. I mean, I think that the excessive quantification of the natural world is probably the culprit there, and that kind of leads back into the education question that we talked about, because I do feel like by far the highest emphasis is on being able to manipulate abstract quantities. I mean, that's essentially what a STEM education is. I mean, you're dealing with concrete applications of it, but the better engineer or programmer you are, the more capable of operating on abstract concepts with logic you're going to be. And that is what's emphasized. And I think that it's right to say that there isn't really room made to learn from nature except in a very superficial way. I mean, I certainly encounter a lot of wishy-washy back to nature type of views as I've been out and about in the world, and a lot of them tend to heavily romanticize hunter-gatherer societies, which I think you're familiar with from some of your own classwork, and to heavily romanticize a return to a pre-rational state in which we're supposedly one with our surroundings. But all that conveniently ignores the severe difference in quality of life and life expectancy, and simply just what you would be able to do with your life in a hunter-gatherer versus now. But I do think that the heavy emphasis on quantity is a big part of nature, and I think a big part of kind of the gutting of nature, and I think that goes along with what you're saying. I think another big part of it is that there really isn't much room made for the Greek term slips my mind, but it began with a TH. It's the
Theoria?
No, it's the Plato's word for the spirited section of themos. Yeah. The spirited section of the soul, which is essentially removed. There isn't really a role for the spiritedness and the striving for great things. That's pretty much taken out of the equation. You simply have matter and you have rationality, which is seen as abstract logic, and the middle part, the spiritedness, the emotion, which is kind of a loaded word, passion, all that has kind of just been removed from the equation and dismissed. And I don't think that because it's been dismissed that it's actually gone. And I think that is, to use the video game analogy again, I think that's a big part of what epic battle games like Halo tap into, is that desire to do great deeds.
Or someone like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, somebody like Jordan Peterson, absolutely, to tap into the desire to do greatness, to defend what's good, and to step out into the unknown and make it known and make it something ordered. I think that's also part of being rational, is like wanting to know the solution, and as opposed to a computer, which can compute, but a computer doesn't have any desire to know the truth. It will just tell you what the quantities add up to or don't add up to that you feed into it. So I mean that's a little bit all over the place, but I think excessive quantification is a major culprit. But it is also understandable because the quantification of nature has unquestionably yielded immense benefits for quality of life.
So can I try to summarize then what we've said so far?
Yeah.
First, we've said that we're basically answering two questions. One, what we think the meaningful life is, and two, why it seems so difficult to have a meaningful life without some kind of artificial intervention, like with video games or LARPing or whatever you want to use. There's plenty of examples.
Right.
I think to the first question, we've said that a meaningful life consists in the experience of living in and having discovered a sense of normativity, a sense of value, and a sense of one's place in a narrative. And then we've said that, and then in order to, and you gave some examples of, I really liked the video game.
I think I think it's the most apt example that I've come across of art imitating what's not in nature right now.
And then to the second question, to why it seems so difficult to have a meaningful life apart from some kind of artificial intervention. You were saying, especially, it seems that the historical loss of the prominence of the world religions, in particular the great monotheistic religions, as the standard, as sort of the standard society-defining organizing principles of society, has done a great deal of damage, because religion especially provides a sense of normativity, a sense of value, and I think in many ways, almost more important than the other two, a sense of narrative.
Yes.
You also said, so alongside the decline in religion, you also said a decline in the sense of ideals, that ideals are largely seen as being responsible for the excesses of the totalitarian and sort of violent excesses of the West. I think other people have expressed that. I forget the guy's name. He's relatively famous for characterizing postmodernism as essentially the widespread suspicion of meta-narratives, which I think, they're not the same thing, obviously, but meta-narratives and ideals, I think, do go along with each other. So I think that I think you're right to also point to the decline in respect for, or you could put that another way. You could say the increase of suspicion of ideals as that's a second influence. And I would also say that the loss of a recognition that nature is knowable and that nature reveals norms and values, I think is a major blow for the accessibility of a meaningful life. I think one way you could schematize the history we're talking about is at one point in time, and obviously these are generalizations which aren't going to be completely accurate, but at one point in time, there wasn't a strong, widespread sense of division between God, values, and nature. Yeah. But that over the course of Western history, and obviously right now we're just talking about the West, over the course of Western history, those three seemingly harmonious realities, for one reason or another, became separated and in some cases actually opposed to each other. Like when you were talking about the quantification of nature, the idea somehow that you would say, just taking God and nature. At one point in time, God and nature were seen to have a very harmonious relationship, but with the development of the natural sciences, some of the assumptions that governed the natural sciences came to see in the quantification of nature evidence that nature was not dependent on God the way that the natural scientists thought that people prior to them had thought nature was. That's a rather roundabout way of putting it, but I think it's key to put it that way, that they saw their understanding of nature as actually pitting nature and God against each other. So that, and then you can see a similar thing with the development of a suspicion of ideals, that formerly ideals and sort of the high sense of values that made you like God at one time have now been unmasked, to use Foucault's term, have been unmasked as power plays and evidence for their ultimately just grasping for power character comes from the fact that there's always been very real but very whitewashed oppression in the name of every ideal. Yeah, I think that's a more recent twist on it, and I think that's also true. And I tend to agree with the assessment of
a lot of postmodernism is really being not postmodern, but a return to pre-modern in some ways. That the denial that there really is some common set of ideals that we can all hold in common and exist communally under. That in reality that doesn't work, and that we're best off retreating into our ethnic groups and into our genders and into our nationalities, and that there's no hope for those categories to understand each other. That a black person will never understand the experience of a white person, and vice versa. A citizen of one country can never truly understand, have any common ground with somebody from another, which seems to essentially deny the possibility of reason arriving at any kind of overarching conclusions about the human condition. The way that you view the world will always be determined entirely by the perspective from which you view it, into which you are already locked in prior to even consciousness, really, or the advent of rationality.
So if we have, I won't say adequately, but if we have at least touched on both the nature of and the magnitude of the issue, that meaningfulness is what meaningfulness is, and why it seems so uniquely problematic nowadays. I think we should at least sketch out the beginning of an answer to what education in particular can do to help resolve that problem. Because I think that it seems obvious to me that the virtual exodus, there's something really not good about that.
I agree.
I think maybe you can't always put your finger on why it's a problem, but I think that most people who are not themselves partaking in the virtual exodus, before they've really kind of gone hook, line, and sinker down that path, I think they would prefer to find those things in the real world. They would prefer to have meaningful relationships with friends, and I think they would prefer to not have to be glued into a screen all the time. Because there have also been the very fact that it's addicting suggests that it isn't good to do that kind of thing. So if we can take the fact that there is this virtual exodus going on, or if we could look at someone like Jordan Peterson, the popularity of Jordan Peterson, we've mentioned him several times, people want meaning, and they don't seem to be getting it. So I think at least, because I think what we should do is probably sketch out the rudiments of a response, and we can maybe develop it in a later episode. But I think the very first thing, if we're talking about how education can contribute to the pursuit of meaning, I think the very first thing you have to say is that education cannot criminalize the preconditions of meaning. And what I mean by that is, if we said that meaning provisionally consists of norms, values, and a sense of narrative, then education cannot look at those and from the very beginning say those are not to be pursued. Because if people are told from a very early age that social norms are inherently oppressive, that clear and definite values are intrinsically violent, or at least violence-inducing, and that narratives are intrinsically illusory and deceptive, then you're going to wind up getting...
And interchangeable.
Interchangeable.
Yeah.
Then you're going to wind up getting precisely the phenomenon that we have agreed is not good. So if the virtual exodus is not good, and if an education that criminalizes all the things that constitute meaning is prompting people in the direction of a virtual exodus, then I think the very first thing we would have to say is that education cannot go about criminalizing those things or saying that those things are not to be pursued. To put it more positively, education needs to encourage a moderate and a prudent but a sincere pursuit of a life lived under norms, a life lived with a sense of values and a sense of narrative. Education should endorse the pursuit of such a thing. I think that's like number one thing. Obviously that's not saying very much, but it is at least stating a very clear principle at the outset of what education should do. And I think you had some thoughts, because I know you mentioned courage and thumos earlier in the, because I know you had some thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, I think that is another ingredient to restore education, is to restore that sense of courage. And I think a enormous part of the appeal of video games in the virtual exodus is the ability to turn over the work of determining rules, order, and right and wrong to another more powerful source. And I was talking about this with someone the other day, and we were comparing it to being a child versus adolescence and adulthood. Whereas if you're fortunate enough to grow up in a functional home, you are able to essentially trust that the norms and the narrative and the structure provided by your parents and the authority figures works and is good, and you just need to do what you need to do within it, and you'll be okay. And you don't have to question that. You can have confidence that the world will continue in that way, and that operating according to those standards will work for you. And I think that is the appeal of video games, is that it's a return to that state in many ways, that you can outsource that and not have to think about it and just operate within it, just be within it. But as anyone knows, on the arrival to adolescence and adulthood, you come to see that there actually is an enormous amount of uncertainty, and that the adults in your life do not know as much as you thought, or were maybe feeling their way along in the dark and making the best guesses that they could, and maybe they made good ones, but there were always alternatives, and that they didn't know precisely what they were doing the entire time. And that's a bit of a scary realization, and then the accompanying realization that you are now also in that position, and that there is no clearly defined path to meaning and to an end goal, and that has to at least be partially defined by you and your relationship to the world. And I think the notion of courage and the spiritedness to press on with the journey despite that uncertainty and fear that presents itself would be a crucial role for education. And I think it often was in the past. Plato discusses that extensively in the Republic, and I think many theorists that follow him speak of similar approaches, where you also need to instill a love of beauty in children and a deep sense of morals, and read them literature that inspires them to do great things and deals with characters that set off into the unknown and achieve greatness despite their fears and despite their limitations. And I think that you kind of need to have a strong reservoir of that courage to press on despite the fact that there is a lack of clarity and uncertainty inherent in the human condition as an adult.
Yeah.
And I think that is a major role for education to play, would be to restore that, because the journey just doesn't seem worth it if you don't have a sense of courage.
Yeah.
And so you're left to kind of play courageousness in a virtual world in which it's fake, because you already have the pre-assurance that what you're doing is going to work and is the right thing.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that in a certain sense it is education versus, well, actually this is kind of interesting, because it, as I was starting what I was going to say, it reminded me of, in the last book, the 10th book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he has a really interesting section where he talks about the relationship between could human happiness, could the human good that we all pursue actually be play? Could it be fun? And he actually seriously lingers over that for a time, because in a certain sense, I mean, there is at least according to his categories, the idea of fun or play it satisfies a great many of those. It's something done. He needs it to be done for its own sake, and it needs to be done
Yeah, that's another to interject. That's another quality in the book Reality is Broken that I hadn't brought up before, but she really emphasizes the voluntary nature of gaming as opposed to compulsory work. And that's a key component of why it is pleasurable, is that you're freely choosing to participate.
And if that's true, I think that is true. That's one of the reasons that games. That's why games are fun. Hey, let's play a game. Like if no one wants to be forced to play a game, it's not fun if you're forced. So I think that so that's one of the reasons that Aristotle really seriously considers it. But he ultimately rules it out because he says something along the lines of, he says it's not worthy of the serious person. And what he means by serious is the person who takes reality seriously, who recognizes that reality is a complex and in many ways dark and kind of violent or at least untamed thing, and that play is in many ways a flight from the difficulties of reality. Because I kind of wanted to say earlier when you were talking about video games they do provide you with a sense of norms, values, and narrative, but they're always way too clear. They're not. It's not really how reality is. It's like the way childhood reality is, like you were saying. But it seems like that education is actually meant to lead you out of that childish sense, the child's sense of security in unquestioned norms, values, and narrative. Because it seems like the danger is that in trying to lead a child out of that security, you'll lead them to give up on meaning altogether. Whereas it seems like what you need, education is meant to basically be, it's the process of growing up guided by those who have already done so, you might say.
Yeah, that's a good way to put
it.
But I would also say that I think that good education does not discard the notion that a life well lived is fun.
Oh, certainly not.
Fun is a word that kind of has a lower connotation as something that's just fluff. But I think when you see somebody that really seems to have put together a meaningful life and they found what they were seemingly meant to do and they're doing it and they're working hard and the results are coming and their strategies are succeeding, they often appear to be having a great deal of fun.
They're joyful.
In their life. They're joyful, yeah. So I think that is perhaps another thing to add, that the notion that you should be able to enjoy whatever life you're living.
I think that's true. What I was trying to get at with the example of moving beyond that child's sense of security is that I think the educated, the mature, educated, well-formed human being is able to enjoy the process of pursuing meaning even without having that full sense of security and having already gotten there.
Yeah.
Because effectively, the video game, the person who plays video games as a way of pursuing meaning isn't really pursuing meaning. He's abdicating the duty to pursue meaning.
Yeah.
He's accepting, because somebody had to design a video game, someone had to write the story, someone had to build the program. He's accepting what somebody else has given him, and it's understandable because there are no massively accessible or available options. But that's still, in the long term, undesirable. It seems like Pascal has that line that nothing gives rest but the sincere pursuit of truth.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that the joy that you're talking about, which characterizes a mature, thoughtful, reflective individual, is a joy that is joyful not only in spite of the insecurity of not having absolute certainty in the meaning they've acquired, but in some ways they have joy in the very process of trying to acquire it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what characterizes the joy of a mature person with the fun of a child or a man-child, if you will.
I agree.
And I think that, because if we've kind of stated in general, I think that education, as I think unfortunately it does, education does frown upon the very preconditions of meaning. So we've said education can't do that. Education should encourage the pursuit of those things, and precisely because it's encouraging them, it should inculcate a spirit of courage. I think that's very generally, what education should do. I think we also need, at this point then, to say, okay, well, how? How is it going to go about doing that? And I think you had actually earlier, prior to recording, you had mentioned a really interesting question, is education like being programmed or instructed in a certain way? Is it like that, or is it, I don't think it's like that, but I don't know exactly. I don't have like a shorthand way of presenting an alternative to being programmed, but at least the way that I had been thinking about it, and you can kind of explain more what you had thought about. I had been thinking of the way to approach this question of how it should be done is education more about learning what to think or how to think?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that it is far more how to think, but there's no way to separate that entirely from what to think. If you have any notion of truth, I mean, it's going to some extent depend on what you're thinking. But it seems that there needs to be and I think this is where the notion of wisdom comes into play, that you need the methods, the shorthand methods, in order to learn what is relevant to solving the problem you wish to solve or understand what you wish to understand, and the discernment to know when to use those and when to think outside of them, and not to become unable to see the solution because of an overcommitment to the heuristics that you're using. And also the understanding that they still may not work to achieve the end goal, and you may have to take a different route. So, I mean, I think of like a concrete example being if you want to learn how to hit a baseball, you're immediately given, if you work with a coach, you're immediately given a number of shorthand ways to get there. They don't just leave you completely in the dark to try everything. They would say, okay, put your feet like this, hold the bat down in the knob like this behind your shoulder, turn your left shoulder toward it, keep your shoulders closed the whole time, keep your eye on the ball, etc. All these shorthand things to just cut out a bunch of unnecessary experimentation. And yet, even if you do all those things, you're still not guaranteed that you will get a hit. And you have to understand that there is not automatically certainty because you're using those methods. And I think that's where wisdom comes into play, to realize that there is no final form that these heuristics take in order to successfully gain insight or solve a problem. And that is, I think, a difficult thing to teach as opposed to programming, because I think a lot of education on both sides of the aisle and in many different ideologies is, a lot of times it seems to be adults attempting to program younger people with programs that are going to make them do things and behave in a way that serves the judgment of the adults as to what is right or what they want to achieve in the world. To be a soldier in the culture war, or to be a good environmentalist, or to be a wealthy person and to rise in society. You're supposed to be receiving programming that will make it almost unconscious. The pursuit and attainment of those goals will be almost unconscious. And I think that good education would be the opposite, into making all the methods, all the lenses, and all the heuristics that you're using something that you're conscious of, so that you can employ and rearrange them in order to fit the problem, and in order to pursue what the ideal or the meaningful activity that you have decided to pursue, and to successfully attain it.
Yeah.
And I think this is an even deeper subject to get into, but I think also and this may kind of fall into the category of the courage, but I think also knowing what to pursue is a huge component of education. Because you can be extremely adept at achieving goals, but if you're not picking worthy goals, then you're a Nazi or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things I want to say to that, but two things stand out. First is, actually I think I can tie them together, so maybe I'll say first that latter question of what to pursue. I think that's where you get into the question of different intellectual traditions. The idea that, maybe even the idea of the so-called great tradition of perhaps the notion that popularized by someone like Mortimer Adler and the Britannica Great Books series, the idea that there has been kind of an unbroken thread, I think is Sohrab Ahmari's term for it, of wisdom, of ideas contributing to an overall view of the world, even though they don't, not everybody who's contributed to this tradition agrees with each other, but there's a sense at a certain level of generality of what ought to be pursued. And I think that the question of tradition is important, but because I also think the second thing I want to say is that to kind of make the analogy, to draw the analogy out with baseball, it seems like a good education is going to acquaint you with the ways that thinkers before have analyzed and answered different problems, different questions. But you start off with specific questions, and you kind of see, okay, how is it done there? How is it done here and here and here? And what you wind up doing is you build what Aristotle would call the habit of the intellectual habit of being able to reason, the intellectual habit of being able to arrive at what he calls quick wit, the ability to see the cause. When someone states a phenomenon, you kind of intuit, okay, here's what's going on here. What education does is it would, I think, instrumentalize in a non-utilitarian way. It would instrumentalize the contributions of the great tradition by handing them to the student, having the student read them, and then by trying to wrestle with what's being said there. In the process, you're forming the habits of analysis, and you're arriving at a certain general conception of the way things are, which then when you leave formal education, I think Jacques Barzun calls it the well-furnished mind. I kind of would prefer to think of it, it's almost like equipment. You've been equipped to look at the world at large and try to ask and answer questions about it similar to the questions and answers that you read in the works of the great tradition, so that you could look at the tradition as effectively the cumulative wisdom comparable to the accumulated wisdom of how to stand when you're batting.
Sure.
It's not purely utilitarian. It's not purely functional the way it is in the case of batting. I think there's more in that tradition. There's more to be said, and obviously that'd be for a different episode. But I think that a good education recognizes the tradition. I'll put it this way, because I think that there is a handing on of the tradition, but it's not a passive handing on. In some ways, the most active handing on of the tradition is doing it in this way, where you actually form the kinds of people who can make contributions to the tradition in the long run. Rather than just have them swallow their ideas, you have them learn to think like these people so that they can actually arrive at and contribute to ideas and contribute to the overall great conversation.
Yeah, there's a sense of lineage that you are in charge with furthering and then training others to carry on.
There's a cool Nietzsche quote about that you really like.
Yeah, I love this quote where I never remember it word for word, but he says something like the fool wishes to reap what he has sowed today, but the truly great tend to the trees that take centuries to blossom. Something along those lines. And that is what the great pursue, is this slow, painful process of tending a garden that is not bound by time, and yet still exists in time and must unfold through time. And to me, that seems like a very worthy goal for education. And that contains both something to do and somewhat of a narrative, and also I think, to me, like, inspires a sense of awe as well, because you're never going to be the one to complete it, and you are standing on the shoulders of giants, as Newton remarked, and the entire project dwarfs any individual contribution to it. And I think that also tends to inspire a sense of duty in the participant, that, I'm in charge of carrying on this lineage, and that is what makes you have a concern for the future. And the concern for children and for the next generation is a concern for this this lineage of understanding that transcends time.
Yeah. So it sounds like then, to summarize, because I think it's helpful to summarize, it seems like what we've been saying then about the how of education is it's somewhere between. Well, it's definitely not programming or just receiving mere instruction, although I think that there are certain phases, at least, of education which are going to be more like that than others. But it's definitely something between learning what to think and learning how to think. Obviously, how it exists between those, I think, would be the subject for the next episode when we really try to flesh out our sketch that we've been working out of what education should do and how it should do it.
Yeah, I think we'll get into that in the next section. The only last thing I'd want to add is I think to again draw on the baseball analogy that, and to incorporate the spiritedness and the courage that we've been discussing. Like, you need to know the methods for hitting the baseball that have been tested over time and passed on by tradition, but you also have to want to hit the ball. You need to have that desire to achieve the result.
Yeah.
And I think that is where that other ingredient of education fits into there. I mean, the best players are often the ones that want it the most. They want to win, and they want to be like the greats of the past. They want to carry on that legacy of Babe Ruth and Mickey Mantle and etc. You want to be like those type of players. And I think that's where the role for the spiritedness also comes into play. You have to want the truth, and you have to want continuity. But I think they all play off each other in an interesting way.
This kind of takes me back to something you were saying earlier about postmodernism, actually, how the postmoderns don't see themselves necessarily as postmodern as much as returning to the pre-modern. The pre-modern is a huge period.
Right.
But it's kind of, because it sounds like what you're saying is deeply Platonic in the sense of Plato. I tend to focus, when I think of Plato, I tend to focus more on his ethical and political rather than his overtly metaphysical positions, although they're bound up with each other. But he is so emphatic on the importance of desire, of well-formed desire, as sort of the motor of education. If the pupil is really, because Socrates is constantly saying, like, I'm just a midwife, I help you deliver your ideas. If as Plato thinks, education is mainly the work of the pupil, guided by the teacher, then the real motor, the drive that's going to actually accomplish education is that desire to reach understanding.
Yeah.
And I think that's something which it's hard to know how to form it, but I think, though, that it's at least important also to not only want to understand, but to want to understand.
Precisely, yeah.
To be really, really roundabout and circumlocutive about it. So
It wouldn't be a discussion without some circumlocution. But I think we'll end it right there, and we will be back with a part 2 on this series where we're going to discuss in more detail I think these four characteristics of education and how it ought to be put into practice. So thank you once again for joining us, and we will reunite real soon. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.